There are towns in the West that make up their minds about a person before that person has finished unpacking. They watch from doorways. They speak in low voices near the post office. They decide, with no particular cruelty and no particular thought, what a woman is allowed to be. And once they have decided, they rarely revisit the matter. Willa Crane had been decided upon. She was a widow at 29, with 2 children, a ranch the bank was watching, and a husband whose death had left more questions than the town had patience to leave unanswered. She had not done anything wrong, but in a place where reputation is the only currency that cannot be borrowed, not doing anything wrong is sometimes not enough. She walked the main street with her head up, and her children close, and her list of supplies she could not quite afford. And the town watched her the way it watches a thing it has already filed away. Some mornings, that is the loneliest kind of cold there is. Then came a Thursday in late October, and a man who arrived with a bedroll, a few tools, and no explanation beyond the simple fact that he was looking for work. He did not ask about the gossip. He did not seem to know it, and if he did, he gave no sign. He fixed what needed fixing. He ate what was set in front of him. He slept in the barn and rose before the light and did not, at any point, ask for more than he had been offered. Some men are like that. They move through the world without demanding that it rearrange itself for them. In a place full of noise and judgment, that kind of quiet is a rare and serious thing. What happened that winter on the Crane Ranch was not loud. It was not the stuff of proclamations or public gestures. It was a chair moved closer to a fire. It was a second lamp lit. It was a man standing in a doorway when someone came with bad intentions, and not raising his voice and not needing to. Some of the most important things that ever happen between 2 people happen in rooms where no one else is watching, and leave no evidence except a life that is quietly, stubbornly better than it was before. This is the story of a woman the town had counted out, and the man who pulled up a chair beside her without asking anyone's permission. It is a story about what it costs to hold your ground alone, and what it feels like when someone stands on it beside you. It is about fire and winter and the particular kind of courage it takes to simply refuse to disappear. She came into town on a Thursday. That detail mattered to her, though she could not have said precisely why. Thursdays had always felt like a day of reckoning to Willa Crane, not the worst of the week, not the best, but the day when whatever you had put off could no longer reasonably be put off. She had 2 children to feed and a list in her coat pocket and 11 cents more than she had expected to have, which was the closest thing to luck she had encountered in several months. She tied the horse at the post and helped the younger one down from the wagon and told the older one to stay close. The town of Carver's Bluff was not a large place. It had a general store, a bank, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, a livery, a saloon that most of the women pretended not to notice, and enough residents to make silence on the main street feel deliberate. Willa had grown up 30 miles east, in a smaller place still, and she had come to Carver's Bluff as a bride 7 years ago, with nothing she was ashamed of and everything she had hoped for. The years since had not been simple. The last year had been the hardest. And now she was a widow, and the town had been watching her the way it watches something it has not quite decided how to categorize. Her husband, Thomas Crane, had died in the spring. The official account was an accident, a fall from the loft of the barn, a thing that happened on ranches. A thing no one could have predicted. But Thomas had owed money to 2 men in town, and one of those men had a loud voice and a talent for implication. And somewhere between the funeral and the summer, a version of events had begun to circulate that was not the true one. Willa had not dignified it with a response. She had buried her husband, gathered her children, and gone back to the work of keeping the ranch alive. That was the only answer she knew how to give, and she gave it every morning before dawn. She pushed open the door of the general store with her elbow, her youngest balanced on her hip. The store smelled of cedar and lamp oil, and the faint sweetness of molasses from the barrel near the back. Mr. Hess was behind the counter, marking something in his ledger. He looked up when she came in and gave her a nod that was civil without being warm, which was more than some people managed. Two women near the dry goods shelf went quiet in a way that suggested they had been speaking freely a moment before. Willa set her youngest down on the floor and handed him a button from her coat pocket to occupy his hands, and moved to the counter with her list. She read the items out, and Mr. Hess gathered them without comment. Flour, salt, a small tin of lard, a length of wicking for the lamps. She had enough for all of it except the coffee, which she quietly removed from the list without explanation, and Mr. Hess wrote the total without remarking on the adjustment. There was a kind of dignity in transacting business cleanly and without sentiment, and she held to it the way she held to most things, steadily, without announcement. Her older child, a girl of 6 named Clara, stood beside her with her hands folded and her eyes on the floorboards, having learned early that stillness was the safest posture in public places. The women near the dry goods shelf did not leave. They arranged and rearranged bolts of cloth with an industry that did not quite convince. One of them was Mrs. Aldrich, who ran the seamstress shop and sat on the front row at church, and had once told Willa, with a smile like a door closing, that people in grief sometimes made poor decisions without realizing it. The other woman Willa did not know well, which meant the other woman probably knew a great deal about her. That was how it worked in small places. The less you knew someone, the more clearly you saw what had been said about them. Willa paid what she owed and gathered her parcels. No one offered to help her carry them. She had not expected anyone to. She lifted the 2 heaviest bags herself and handed the lighter one to Clara, and picked the youngest up again with the arm she had free and pushed back out through the door into the cold. The air outside was sharp and clean and smelled of pine and coming frost. The sky above the ridge was the particular gray of late October when the season has made up its mind. She loaded the wagon with the efficiency of a woman who has done everything herself for long enough that she no longer thinks of it as a hardship. It was simply the shape of the work. At the bank, she waited on the bench outside the manager's office for 12 minutes before he saw her. His name was Garrett, and he was not unkind, but he was precise, and precision in a banker generally delivered the same news that unkindness would. The loan on the property had been extended once. He could extend it once more through the winter, but in the spring he would need a payment that was not partial. He said this with his eyes on his desk, which was the way men delivered news they preferred not to have to deliver. Willa thanked him and stood and walked out. She did not let herself think about spring until she was back at the wagon. The ride home took the better part of an hour. The road followed a creek bed and then climbed through a stand of pines before dropping down into the valley where the ranch sat. In summer, the valley was green, and the creek ran clear, and it was possible to feel on the right kind of morning that the land itself was on your side. In late October, the grass had gone the color of old straw, and the creek had narrowed, and the fence along the east pasture had 3 posts down that she had been meaning to address since August. The cattle that were left, 7 head, where there had been 14, moved slowly near the far tree line. Clara sat beside her on the bench and did not ask questions. She had that quality, even at 6, of understanding when silence was the right companion. Willa unhitched the horse and watered him and brought the parcels inside and set the fire going and started supper from what she had, which was not much, but was enough. While the pot heated, she stood at the window and looked at the fence. 3 posts down along the east line and the cattle drifting, and the pass would close in another 3 or 4 weeks. And after that, there would be no getting materials in or out until spring. She knew how to set a fence post. She had done it before. But there was the roof over the barn door that had also been pulling loose since September, and the well cover that had cracked, and the latch on the gate that caught wrong and had to be lifted with a particular motion that only she and Clara knew. There was always more than one person could address alone. She fed the children and got them settled, and sat by the fire with the ledger open on her knee and the lamp turned low to save the oil. The numbers were what they were. She looked at them long enough to be sure she had not missed anything, which she had not, and then she closed the ledger and set it on the cedar chest beside the chair. The fire had settled to a steady burn, orange and quiet. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the pines above the ridge with that low sound that was neither mournful nor cheerful, but simply continuous. The horse shifted in the corral. The youngest made a small sound in his sleep. Willa Crane sat in the firelight and did not despair, because despair was a luxury she had not budgeted for. She simply sat and thought and waited for whatever Thursday would eventually become. He appeared on a Tuesday, which was not a day Willa had been expecting anything. He came up the road on a gray horse that moved without hurry, and he stopped at the gate and sat there a moment before he called out, which she appreciated. Men who called out before entering were different from men who simply entered, and she had learned to notice the difference. She was splitting wood near the barn when he arrived, and she set the axe down but did not put it away. He said he was looking for work, short-term, whatever needed doing. His name was Cooper Hale. He said it the way a man states a fact that is neither impressive nor embarrassing, plainly and without addition. She looked at him the way a woman looks at something she is trying to place. He was not young and not old, somewhere in the long middle stretch of a man's life when the work he has done begins to show in the way he carries himself. His coat was clean but worn at the elbows. His hands on the reins were the hands of someone who had used them for most of his years. He had no visible weapon, which some men in that country considered an oversight and others considered a statement. He did not smile to put her at ease, which she found, oddly, more reassuring than if he had. She asked him if he had references. He said he had a name she could ask about at the livery in Millhaven, 2 towns east. She told him she would pay $3 for 3 days if he could start on the fence. He started on the fence that afternoon. She watched from the kitchen window while she kneaded the bread, not because she was suspicious, or not only because of that, but because she had learned that the first hour of watching a man work told you most of what you needed to know about him. Cooper Hale did not rush. He did not perform. He walked the fence line first, the whole length of it, before he touched a single post, and he crouched down at each broken section and looked at it carefully, the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand before he decides what it requires. Then he went to the barn for the tools she had pointed out, and he began. And he did not stop until the light was too low to see by. Supper that first evening was a practical arrangement. She set a plate on the small table near the barn door and told him it was there. He ate outside, alone, and returned the plate to the porch step when he was done, washed clean with water from the trough. She had not asked him to wash it. Clara watched from the window and reported this fact as though it were significant, and Willa said only that it was polite and moved on. But she noted it. There are small things that tell you what a person considers ordinary behavior, and a man who washes the plate he has been lent is telling you something, even if he does not know he is telling you anything. The second day, he repaired the barn door. Roof. She had not mentioned it. He had simply looked at it in the early morning light and seen what it needed and begun. She came out at mid-morning with coffee, and found him on the roof with a handful of cedar shingles he had found stacked behind the barn, fitting them with the quiet concentration of someone for whom this kind of work was neither a burden nor a novelty, but simply a thing that needed to be done, and therefore was being done. She set the coffee on the fence rail below, and he nodded without stopping. She went back inside. Some things do not require comment. The children observed him with the particular caution of children who have learned that new presences in their world do not always remain. Clara watched openly, with the directness of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to disguise her assessments. The youngest, whose name was Henry and who had just turned 3, watched from behind Clara's arm, which was his preferred position when encountering the unfamiliar. Cooper Hale did not make overtures toward them. He did not crouch down and make large, friendly gestures the way some adults did with small children, as though children were a species requiring special handling. He simply went about his work and let them watch, and occasionally said something brief and factual if one of them was near enough to address. Clara appeared to find this acceptable. Henry continued to watch from behind her arm, but with decreasing urgency. On the evening of the second day, Mrs. Aldrich came by. She came ostensibly to return a pie dish she had borrowed in July, which Willa had not been expecting back and which could not, in any reasonable accounting, have required returning on that particular evening. She stood on the porch and held the dish and let her eyes move to the barn, where the lamp was lit and the shape of Cooper Hale's work was visible through the open door. She said she had heard Willa had taken on a hand. Willa said she had hired someone for 3 days to fix the fence. Mrs. Aldrich said that it was unusual, a woman alone, to have a man she did not know sleeping on the property. Willa took the pie dish and said she appreciated her concern and went back inside. She stood at the closed door for a moment after, not angry exactly, but aware of the particular weight that other people's opinions add to a life that is already carrying enough. By the 3rd day the fence was done and the barn roof was sound, and the well cover had been replaced with a new one Cooper had cut from a board he found in the lean-to behind the smokehouse. Willa had not asked him to do any of it except the fence. She came out in the late afternoon expecting to pay him and tell him the work was complete and find him saddling the gray horse. Instead, she found him at the gate latch, which he had taken apart, and was reassembling with a small adjustment that would, she saw immediately, correct the lift-and-catch problem that had plagued it since August. He had noticed. He had simply noticed, in the course of coming and going, and was fixing it without any announcement or expectation of additional pay. She stood and watched him finish. He set the latch back and opened and closed the gate twice to test it, and it moved cleanly both times. He looked at it with the brief satisfaction of a man who has corrected something that was wrong, and then he looked at her, and she said she had $3 more if he could stay another 3 days because the east pasture post rail still needed work before the frost set in for good. He considered this for a moment, not as though he were weighing better options, but the way a man considers something he wants to be sure he is deciding honestly. Then he said he could stay. He said it without elaboration. She nodded and went inside to start supper, and that was the whole of the negotiation. That night, while the children slept and the fire settled, and the wind came through the valley with the first real edge of the coming winter on it, Willa sat with her ledger and noted the additional $3 in the column of expenditures. The fence was sound. The roof held. The gate opened cleanly. She looked at the numbers for a while, and then she closed the book and looked at the fire, and something in the set of her shoulders was, if not lighter, then at least not heavier than it had been the evening before. Some things are too large for naming, but sometimes the knowledge that the fence will hold through the winter is enough to let a person breathe. The 3 days became a week. The week became 2. The pass road showed the first dusting of snow on a Thursday morning, which the old-timers in Carver's Bluff understood as a warning more than a weather event. Once the pass went, it went, and whatever you had not arranged before then became a thing you would not arrange until spring. Cooper Hale had a bedroll and a gray horse, and no particular place that was waiting for him, and there was still work on the Crane Ranch that a single woman with 2 small children and 7 head of cattle could not reasonably complete before the cold came down for good. So he stayed. Neither of them made a declaration of this. It was simply the arithmetic of the situation laid out plainly, and both of them could read it. The arrangement shifted in small ways as the second week settled in. He began eating at the table because Willa had set a plate there one evening without comment, and there was no graceful way to carry it outside in weather that had dropped to freezing after dark. He sat at the far end, near the door, and ate what she put in front of him, and said when it was good, which it usually was, in the brief way of a man who means what he says and does not add to it. Clara began to talk during supper, which she had not done in some time, and her talking filled the silence in the room in a way that made the silence itself feel different, less like an absence, and more like a frame around something that was gradually acquiring shape. Henry watched Cooper from across the table with the unguarded intensity of a 3-year-old who has not yet learned to conceal his curiosity. He did not speak to him directly for the first several days. He simply observed, with great seriousness, everything Cooper did. The way he held his fork, the way he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, the way he pushed back his chair when he was done and set his hands flat on the table for a moment before standing. Then one evening Henry reached across the table and placed 2 fingers on Cooper's forearm and said nothing. And Cooper looked down at the small hand and then back at his plate and continued eating. And Henry withdrew his hand, apparently satisfied with whatever information he had gathered. Clara saw it and said nothing. Willa at the stove had her back turned, but she had heard the silence that followed, which was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. The storm came on a Wednesday night without much preliminary announcement. The wind came first, then the snow, and by morning the yard was under 8 inches and the pass road had closed, and that was the end of any reasonable discussion of Cooper Hale leaving before spring. He was in the barn when she came out that morning, already seeing to the cattle and the horse, and she helped him without either of them needing to organize it aloud. They worked side by side in the barn for 2 hours while the snow continued, and the children stayed inside as she had told them to, and at no point during those 2 hours did either of them say anything that was not directly relevant to the task at hand. And yet, something was communicated. The way things are communicated between people who are paying attention to each other without making a production of it. It was Clara who told her. Clara came inside from an errand to the woodpile on an evening about a week into the storm, and said, with the directness that was her particular quality, that Mr. Hale was eating outside again. Willa looked up from the pot she was tending. She had not known he had started doing that again. She put the spoon down and took her coat from the hook by the door and went out, and she found him sitting on the upturned crate he used as a seat near the barn door, a plate balanced on his knee, eating in the dark and the cold with the matter-of-fact composure of a man who is used to making do and does not consider his own comfort a subject worth raising. She stood in the doorway of the barn and looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her without apology or explanation, which was his way. She said there was room at her fire, and he did not need to eat in the cold. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, not unkindly, but without any excessive warmth that might make the offer into something he felt obligated to weigh. He looked at the plate in his hands and then at her, and he said he had not wanted to presume. She said he was not presuming. She went back inside, and after a moment she heard his boots on the porch step. He came in and hung his coat on the peg near the door, below hers, and sat at the table and finished his supper. Willa moved the second lamp from the shelf to the table so the light was better. It was a small thing. She did it without remarking on it, and he did not remark on it either. Clara looked at the lamp and then at her mother, and then went back to the drawing she was making on the back of an old letter. Henry had fallen asleep in the chair near the hearth, tipped sideways with his cheek on the armrest and one hand hanging down. At some point during the evening, without any discussion, Cooper moved his chair a few inches closer to the fire, because the draft from the door was considerable and the corner where he sat was the coldest part of the room. He did it quietly. The chair legs made almost no sound on the floor. But the room was smaller after that, in the way that rooms become smaller when the people in them are no longer arranged at the maximum possible distance from each other. Harlan Price came on a Friday morning, which was not a surprise. Price owned the feed store and a parcel of land east of the creek, and a great appetite for acquiring things that other people were struggling to hold on to. He had made an offer on the Crane property in the summer, after Thomas died, that was so far below its value that Willa had not even answered it in writing. She had simply said no at the post office when he raised it, in front of 3 other people, which had not endeared her to him. He knocked at the door in the manner of a man who considers knocking a formality rather than a request. When the door opened, he found Cooper Hale standing in it. Price looked at Cooper and then passed him into the room, where Willa stood at the stove with her back straight and her expression even. Price said he had come to speak with Mrs. Crane about a business matter. Cooper said she was occupied. He said it without raising his voice or shifting his weight or doing anything that could be described as threatening. He simply stood in the doorway and said what was true, in the tone of a man reporting a fact. Price looked at him for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he is trying to calculate, and then said he would come back another time. Cooper said that was fine. He closed the door without haste and turned back to the room. Willa had not moved from the stove. Their eyes met briefly, and then she went back to what she was cooking, and he went back to the chair by the fire, and that was the end of it. The room was quiet. Henry made a small sound in his sleep. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Spring came the way it always came to that valley, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week, then a cold snap, then a morning when the creek sounded different and you went out and found the ice at the edges had pulled back an inch and the water beneath was running clear and fast. The cattle moved differently when the grass began to show again, with a kind of forward lean that was not quite urgency, but was the animal version of hope. The fence held. The barn roof held. The gate opened cleanly on its repaired latch and had done so every morning since November, without requiring the particular lift-and-catch motion that only Willa and Clara had known. These were not small things. They were the infrastructure of a life, and they held. Cooper Hale had not left. He had not announced that he was staying either, which was consistent with everything else about him. He had simply continued to be present and useful, and the days had continued to accumulate, and at some point over the winter the question of whether he would leave had quietly ceased to be the organizing question of the ranch's daily life. He had moved from the barn to the lean-to room off the back of the house when the temperature dropped below what was reasonable even for a man accustomed to hardship, and this too had been managed without ceremony. Willa had said there was a room, and he had said he was obliged, and that had been the totality of the conversation. The room had a small window and a cot and a hook on the back of the door, and his coat hung on that hook every night and was gone from it every morning before she came to start the fire. By March, Clara had stopped calling him Mr. Hale in the house. She called him Cooper, which was his name, and he answered to it without correction. Henry called him something that was not quite either name but was clearly directed at him and at no one else, and Cooper responded to this as well, with the same steady attention he gave to everything Henry said, which was not always intelligible and was always received seriously. There is a particular quality in a man who listens to a 3-year-old without condescension and without performance, without making a show of his patience, simply extending it as a matter of course. Willa had noticed this quality in October and had gone on noticing it all winter, and she did not put a name to what the noticing meant because some things are better understood slowly, the way ground thaws, from underneath first and then the surface last. The first Sunday in April, she told the children to put on their good things. Clara asked if they were going to church, and Willa said they were. Clara looked toward the lean-to room and asked if Cooper was coming. Willa was quiet for a moment, and then she went to the door of the lean-to and said there was room in the wagon, if he wanted to come. He was sitting on the edge of the cot, pulling on his boots. He looked at her in the doorway and then at his boots and then back at her. He said he would get his coat. She went back to help Henry with his buttons, and a few minutes later, Cooper came out with his hair combed and his good shirt on, which she had not known he owned, and they went out to the wagon and drove the 4 miles to Carver's Bluff in the early morning light without any particular conversation, the children between them on the bench. The church was nearly full when they arrived. They came in during the opening hymn, which meant the congregation was standing, and the sound was large enough that individual entrances went unremarked. They took the 3rd pew from the front, which was where Willa had always sat when Thomas was alive, and which she had not sat in since. She went in first, then Henry, then Clara, then Cooper at the outside end. They stood and sang, or in Cooper's case, stood and held the hymnal open without singing, which was as much participation as could reasonably be expected from a man who had not been inside a church in some years. Willa did not look around at the congregation. She looked at the front of the room and sang the words she knew, which were most of them. It was during the sitting down after the hymn that the quiet happened. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a great deal of attention suddenly redirected. She felt it without looking for it, the way a room changes when people in it shift what they are watching. She kept her eyes forward. Henry leaned against her arm and she let him. Clara sat straight with her hands in her lap the way she had been taught. Cooper sat at the end of the pew with his hat on his knee and his eyes on the minister, and whatever the congregation made of the 4 of them sitting in the 3rd pew on a Sunday morning in April, he gave no sign of noting it. That composure was not indifference. It was something more considered than indifference. It was the settled quality of a man who has decided what he is doing and does not require the town's agreement to proceed. Afterward, in the yard outside the church, something shifted. It was not an apology, and it was not an embrace, and it was not the dramatic reversal of opinion that stories sometimes assign to these moments. It was quieter than that. Mr. Garrett from the bank tipped his hat to her and said good morning, which he had not done in several months. One of the women who had been near the dry goods shelf in October nodded from across the yard with an expression that was not warm but was no longer the other thing it had been. Even Mrs. Aldrich, who was standing near the church door with her particular posture of civic authority, looked at Willa and then at Cooper and then looked away without saying anything at all. Silence in certain mouths is as close to an apology as you are going to get. Willa accepted it for what it was and moved on. She paid the bank in full on a Tuesday in early May. It was not a large sum, but it was the whole of what was owed, and she set it on Garrett's desk in coin and in a small fold of bills, and he wrote the receipt and handed it across and said the account was clear. She folded the receipt and put it in her coat pocket and walked out into the spring morning. The main street was busy with the ordinary business of a town coming back to life after winter. She walked to the wagon and drove home along the creek road, and the water was high and clear and fast over the stones, and the willows along the bank had gone the new bright green that they went every April, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine, and something sweet she could not name that was simply the smell of the season, changing in a valley she had worked to stay in, and had stayed. When she got home, Cooper was in the pasture with the cattle, moving the lead animal toward the upper field, where the new grass was coming in thickest. He raised a hand when he saw the wagon, not in a wave exactly, but in the acknowledgement of a man who had noted her return and found it right. She raised a hand back. Clara came out of the house with Henry behind her to help unload the small bundle of supplies she had brought from town, and the 4 of them moved between the wagon and the porch in the ordinary relay of a household that knows its own rhythms. The afternoon went on around them. The fire burned. The creek ran. The pines above the ridge held their particular stillness, the way they always did when the wind dropped, as though listening to something the valley below was saying. The horse moved in the corral. The smoke from the chimney rose straight and white into the blue spring sky and disappeared. The world continued, the way the world does, indifferent to the dramas of the people in it, and generous in its own unremarked way to those who are still standing in it come spring. The gate opened and closed on its repaired latch. The fence held along the east pasture, and in the third pew of a church in Carver's Bluff, 4 people had sat on a Sunday morning, and the town had gone quiet, and the quiet had meant something, even if no one had said what. And that was the story of Willa Crane and Cooper Hale, a woman who walked through a winter that was trying to finish her, and a man who pulled up a chair beside her fire without asking anyone's permission, and the 2 children who watched the whole thing from the beginning and knew before either adult did that this was what staying looked like. Let me know in the comments how this one felt. I hope it found you well. See you in the next one.